recording. So, hi, Atsuko. It's a great pleasure to have you with us for this interview that will be published as part of the Atlashaw Goddard Africa newsletter. You're an Africa business and agriculture expert working for the African Development Bank. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background and your role at the African Development Bank?
Hi, Alex. Thank you so very much. My name is Atsuko Toda. I'm the Director for Ag Finance and Rural Infrastructure Development at the African Development Bank. I currently hold the role of the Acting Vice President for Agriculture, Human and Social Capital Development also. With regards to my role at the bank, currently I'm overseeing the Feed Africa strategic, one of the high fives called Feed Africa, and also something called Improving the Quality of Life of Africans. So that includes water and sanitation, healthcare infrastructure, gender, jobs for youth, and agriculture, which I think are some of the most exciting topics that really interface with livelihoods on the African continent. With regards to the Feed Africa agenda, this is primarily a value chain-led approach. So we're looking at strategic value chains across the African continent, trying to coordinate both public and private sector, and putting much more investment with regards to strengthening these value chains. With regards to my background, I used to work primarily in Asia, but I moved to Africa, started off in Nigeria, where I worked with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, mainly rural development projects. And it's been really exciting to move from a rural development focused context to a much more commercial focus on promoting agriculture, going to scale with technologies, with production, with productivity, and seeing what we can do much more engaged with the private sector. With regards to our convening power, I think the African Development Bank primarily works with governments to be able to support their priorities.
Yeah. And how long have you been living in Africa now?
I was in Nigeria for 4 years, and now it's my 5th year in Cote d'Ivoire, so it's almost a decade in Africa.
Oh my goodness, yeah, it's great. And I think you've become one of the leading experts in that space. So we're really happy to have you on this interview today with us. As you know, as we all know, Africa is a huge continent, and the landmass of Africa can actually fit the US, China, India, Japan, Mexico, and many European nations combined. And agriculture is the main source of income for many people living on the continent. Improvements in the sector can have significant impact on many economies and people in Africa. Where do you see are the biggest opportunities for investments in the agricultural sector on the continent?
Well, Alex, if we take a step back and look at population growth and urbanization, currently about 50% of Africa's population lives in urban areas. So that is a huge opportunity in terms of demand for food. And there'll be, urban populations look for accessible, ready-to-go processed foods. So there's a huge opportunity for, number one, agro-processing. Number two, to get the food from where it is produced to where it is consumed, there's also opportunities for logistics, for transport, for storage. So that's also extremely important. I think just in general, the population growth is extremely high, and that means that there will be an increasing demand for food. If you look at European markets, US markets, there's a lot of competition, a level of saturation with regards to markets. But when it comes to Africa and when it comes to feeding Africa's cities, there's a lot of market and business potential. And with the overlay of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, number one, so that you have a much stronger regional market. Number two, with the COVID crisis, I think there has been a lot of thought with regards to how do we shorten value chains? How do we make them more resilient? So there's also a move towards what can we get locally? How can we actually get content locally? And so really the backward integration of these value chains is very important. So I think the combination of the COVID crisis, the need for more resilient value chains, the need to feed Africa's cities, the fact that actually the food supply chain today is worth about 750 billion, but will grow to 1 trillion by 2025. I think all of these things point to many market and business opportunities for private sector to be able to invest more heavily. And then also with governments to put in the policy and regulatory frameworks to enable the business environment, that conversation is much more active, and you see a lot more political will to promote the private sector. And I think that also is very important.
Excellent. I mean, yeah, you talk about in governments, I mean, and policy and policy environment. I had always thought that this is probably some of the challenges that you have in Africa related to land reform and issues of, I mean, trade, but some of these challenges are being tackled. But from a big picture point of view, what do you think are the biggest challenges that are holding up these opportunities, and also for the private sector to be involved? Where do you see the biggest barriers?
I think for the private sector, there's actual and perceived risks. With regards to agricultural value chains, you will always have climate-related risks. You always have commodity price risks. I think with regards to production in general, productivity remains quite low. So how do you actually get the quantity and quality in a much more kind of timely way? That's one. Logistics and infrastructure, there's a lot of need for financing the infrastructure. And because African governments are, to a certain extent, in the kind of a period of debt management crisis, which is ongoing, there's a lot more need for us to think together about public-private partnerships, and those are very complex transactions. And then with regards to the challenges around policy that we just mentioned, we just need a much more kind of stable and coherent policy to ensure that private sector is having the regulatory framework necessary. And I think, Alex, you touched upon a very important point, which is land, coupled with the business environment, coupled with the types of standards and quality that needs to be put in place, and policy which needs to be enforced. So these are kind of some of the challenges that I think private sector faces, and to a greater extent agribusiness faces on the African continent.
Yeah, and I mean, and you personally, and then of course your institution, you're at the forefront of, I mean, working in this sector, and I mean, could you, I mean, and I think you're doing amazing work, but for our audience, maybe explain a little bit what you think is the role, the vision, and the mission of the African Development Bank and your latest initiatives. If you can just give us a broad overview. I know you're doing a lot of things, but just at a high level, that would be great.
Sure. So some of the emphasis that the African Development Bank is putting is really about going to scale. So the idea is to identify transformational projects, look at regional value chains, see what we can invest in that would help more private sector to invest. So it's really about how do we take certain technologies, for example, to scale. There has been a lot of improved varieties, technologies which are on the shelf, and we have a program for technologies for African agricultural transformation called TAT, which has looked at some of these improved varieties. And now the issue is, how do we get more farmers to adopt? How do we actually go to scale? How do we get more government commitment? How do we identify those infrastructure pieces which are so important to get logistics and transport in place? So the African Development Bank has been trying to help countries or support countries with regards to some of their priorities around technologies for African agricultural transformation, special agro-industrial processing zones, value chain projects, to be able to scale more quickly and accelerate the transformation as part of their structural transformation that is taking place.
Great. Atsuko, thank you so much for your insight and for taking the time to talking to us and enhancing our Africa newsletter for this month. It's very cool to have you on, and thank you for your insight again.